The chandeliers blazed above like captured constellations, scattering light across crystal glasses and polished silverware. The orchestra's strings swelled, their refined harmonies blending with the low hum of laughter, conversations, and champagne flutes clinking. The Grand Marlowe Hotel, with its gilded walls and mirrored arches, had never looked so resplendent. But Samuel Marlowe stood at the edge of that glittering world, a solitary shadow among the shine. The old man's shoulders sagged under the weight of years. Yet there was still a quiet poise about him, an elegance too subtle for those who only measured worth in wealth and youth. His white hair was slicked back neatly. His suit was modest but pressed with care, and his thin-rimmed glasses reflected the warm glow of the ballroom chandeliers. He had been invited not as a guest, not as an equal among the elite, but as an afterthought, a local tailor called upon at the last minute when a minor inconvenience struck. And that inconvenience now rested in the hands of a groomsman who sneered as he held up a torn black jacket for all nearby to see. The fabric gaped under the arm, threads frayed like an open wound. "Look at this disaster," the groomsman said loudly, ensuring that laughter followed his words. "Can you believe it? Hours before the wedding, and the groom's jacket looks like it got into a fight with a dog." Guests nearby chuckled. Someone muttered, "You'd need a miracle to fix that." Another chimed in, "Or a time machine, go back and buy a new one." The groomsman turned, his eyes landing on Samuel. His smirk widened. "Well, maybe our stitchman here can patch it up." A ripple of laughter spread through the group. "Patch it like a sock," another added. "Or a curtain," someone else snorted. Samuel's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. He had heard these tones before, dismissive, mocking, designed to cut deeper than any needle ever could. "Come on, old man," the groomsman teased, stepping closer. "Show us what you've got. You've still got steady hands, right? Or are they shaking too much these days?" The torn jacket was shoved into his arms. The weight of it pressed against his chest, not because of the fabric, but because of what it represented, another reminder that in their eyes, he was nothing more than a relic with a needle. For a long moment, Samuel said nothing. He studied the jacket, his fingers brushing over the torn seam. And the ballroom began to blur. The music dulled. The laughter faded. In his mind, he was no longer in a hotel ballroom in America. He was in Paris, Rue Saint-Honoré, his studio filled with sunlight, the air alive with the rustle of silks, the faint scent of chalk dust and warm steam from pressing irons. Sketches covered his walls, elegant gowns, daring suits, visions of lines and shapes that would define not just a season but an era. He remembered women stepping out of limousines in his designs, cameras flashing, the whispers of his name passing through the corridors of fashion houses. Once, Samuel Marlowe had been more than a tailor. He had been an architect of beauty. And yet here, in this glittering ballroom thousands of miles away, no one knew, no one cared. He blinked, and the vision dissolved. The mocking voices returned. "Well," the groomsman prodded, "you gonna fix it, or just stare at it?" Samuel's voice was low but steady. "Give me a table," and a little silence. The request drew more laughter, but someone dragged a chair aside, shoving a small round table into place. Samuel sat, his movements deliberate, unhurried. He reached into his worn leather bag, pulling out a sewing kit whose brass clasp was dented and scratched with age. It looked unimpressive, almost pitiful, but when he opened it, the tools inside gleamed, each one cared for with reverence. The needle in his hand caught the chandelier light. His fingers, though lined with age, were steady as he threaded it with fine black silk. "Watch closely," he murmured, more to himself than to them. The groomsmen leaned in, smirking, waiting to be entertained. The guests nearby tilted their heads. Curiosity piqued. Even the bride, radiant in white, slowed her laughter and turned her gaze toward the old man. Samuel began. The needle darted in and out, swift and precise, weaving a rhythm that seemed almost musical. He did not merely close the tear, he reimagined it. His stitches reinforced the seam with strength invisible to the eye, his thread blending seamlessly into the weave of the fabric. His hands moved like dancers across a stage, each motion elegant, practiced, inevitable. The ballroom quieted. The quartet still played, but their music became only a backdrop to the silent performance unfolding at the side table. Minutes passed. The groomsmen's smirks faltered. The bride leaned forward, lips parted. The groom, alerted by the sudden hush, approached. Frowning in confusion, Samuel tied the final knot, snipped the thread with a quiet snap, and smoothed the jacket flat. He stood, holding it up to the light. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The torn seam was gone. No, more than gone. The jacket looked renewed, sharper, more dignified. The line of the shoulders had been subtly adjusted. The drape of the fabric refined. What had been a ruined garment now appeared custom-made, worthy of the very celebration it was meant to adorn. The groom stepped forward, disbelief on his face. Is that my jacket? Try it, Samuel said simply. The young man slipped into the jacket. The room inhaled collectively. The fit was perfect, hugging his frame as though it had been cut for him alone. The shoulders carried nobility. The waistline tapered in subtle grace. The fabric no longer sagged but seemed to move with its wearer. Whispers broke the silence. That's impossible. Did he just? It looks better than new. The groomsmen exchanged uneasy glances. Their laughter had vanished, replaced with something like unease, or perhaps guilt. The bride stepped forward, her eyes wide. How did you do that? Samuel gave a small smile, faint but full of meaning. With care, with time, with respect for the cloth. The ballroom fell into silence again. But this time it was not mockery, it was awe. Yet among the crowd, one pair of eyes widened with recognition. A woman, older, draped in pearls and velvet, leaned forward in her chair. Her voice, though quiet, carried across the sudden hush. I know that work, she whispered. I know those hands. Samuel's heart stilled. He turned toward her, and memory surged once more. Paris, a runway show, the applause of critics, and this woman, years younger, stepping onto his stage in a gown he had created. Mon Dieu, she breathed. It's you. The ballroom erupted in questions, voices layering over one another. Who is he? What does she mean? Do you know him? The woman rose to her feet, trembling slightly as she pressed a hand to her chest. Once, she said, her voice breaking, he was one of the greatest designers in Paris. All eyes turned to Samuel. The old tailor stood beneath the chandeliers, the repaired jacket still draped across the groom's frame, his modest sewing kit at his side. He said nothing. He only bowed his head slightly, as though acknowledging a truth long buried. And in that silence, the ballroom felt less like a place of mockery, and more like a stage, one that Samuel Marlowe had never truly left. The ballroom had not returned to normal. The laughter that once rippled so easily was now replaced by murmurs, soft as the rustle of silk gowns brushing across polished marble. Guests who had moments earlier dismissed him as an old relic now leaned forward, eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and disbelief. Samuel Marlowe stood still, shoulders squared, his sewing kit resting by his side. The groom's jacket, his small triumph, gleamed under the chandeliers, worn with newfound pride. But what unsettled Samuel most was the woman in pearls. She had risen from her chair with trembling grace, her eyes never leaving his. The years had etched lines into her face, but he could still see the contours of youth beneath them, the cheekbones once captured in photographs, the posture once envied by rivals. Madame Duval, he murmured, almost to himself. A hush fell across those close enough to hear. The bride's eyes darted between Samuel and the woman, her curiosity mounting. The woman pressed a gloved hand against her chest. I thought you had vanished, she said softly, her French accent wrapping around each word like a velvet ribbon. I had, Samuel replied, her lips parted as though to ask more. But the bride and groom interrupted, pulling her into their circle with 100 questions. Who was he? What did she mean? Madame Duval smiled faintly, but her gaze remained on Samuel. He was not just a tailor. Once, in Paris, he was a creator. His name walked the boulevards on the lips of the fashionable. Samuel Marlowe designed for queens and dreamers. The bride gasped. A ripple of astonishment moved through the guests. Samuel felt the weight of their stares pressing into him. He wanted to retreat, to sink back into obscurity. But there was no escape. He could almost hear Paris calling back to him, streets echoing with the click of heels, the distant bells of Notre Dame, the thunder of applause in gilded theaters. His mind slipped backward. Paris, 1968. The studio was alive with chaos. Rolls of fabric spilled across the floor, silk in shades of midnight, ivory, and crimson. Mannequins lined the walls, draped in half-finished gowns that shimmered like dreams caught in fabric. The air carried the scent of chalk dust, steam, and jasmine cigarettes smoked by anxious assistants. At the center of it all, a younger Samuel Marlowe stood like a conductor before his orchestra. His dark hair fell across his brow. His shirt sleeves rolled up. His fingers stained with chalk. He moved from mannequin to sketch to cutting table with an energy that seemed inexhaustible. Non, the line must flow, he barked in French, snatching a sketch from an apprentice and redrawing it with sharp, confident strokes. Fashion is movement. It must breathe. If it does not, it dies. Assistants scrambled to keep up. Models leaned against doorframes, watching him with admiration and a hint of impatience. And then she entered, Madame Isabelle Duval. At that time, she was not yet the society matron she would become but the star of Parisian runways. A muse to photographers and critics alike. Draped in a robe, she stepped onto the platform where Samuel awaited. Try this, he said, lifting a gown of deep emerald silk. She slipped into it, and as the assistants fastened the back, Samuel stepped back, his eyes sharp. The room fell silent. The gown shimmered with light as though it had been cut from the very heart of a jewel. Its lines were fluid, cascading with elegance, and yet it clung in all the right places, sculpting her into something more than human, an icon, a goddess. When she turned before the mirror, she gasped softly, Mon Dieu. Samuel smiled faintly. Not God, just cloth, but cloth that understands. The applause from his team filled the studio, but Samuel hardly heard it. He was already imagining the next piece, the next creation. In those days, success felt inevitable. His name began appearing in magazines, whispered in salons, admired in smoky cafes where artists and poets gathered. Journalists wrote of the young Marlowe with an eye for eternity. His runway shows became events. His designs copied by rivals and worshipped by clients. Paris had embraced him. He was not merely a tailor, he was a designer, an artist. But Paris could be cruel. Back in the ballroom, Samuel gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles whitening as the memory ebbed. Madame Duval was still watching him, her expression a mixture of pride and sorrow. She had known him in his glory. And perhaps, she had known him in his downfall. The groom broke the silence. Why didn't anyone know this? Why are you here? The question was innocent, but it sliced deeper than intended. Samuel's throat tightened. He could not answer, not yet. His story was not for their amusement, not to be consumed like another anecdote between glasses of champagne. Instead, he simply said, life takes us places we do not expect. The bride touched the sleeve of the restored jacket. Awe in her voice. But you made this, in minutes. That's not just tailoring, that's design. Madame Duval finished softly. Always design. The orchestra struck a note, jolting the room back toward celebration. But the air had changed. Conversations buzzed with Samuel's name, with speculation, with recognition. Samuel gathered his sewing kit and made to leave. He had no desire to bask in their newfound curiosity. But as he turned, a hand caught his wrist. The groom. Stay, the young man said firmly. You've given me more than a jacket tonight. You've given me pride. His voice faltered. Please, stay. Samuel hesitated. Then, slowly, he nodded. Later that evening, long after the vows had been spoken and the dancing had begun, Samuel found himself standing at the edge of the ballroom once more. He watched the young couple twirl, their laughter free and unburdened. And again, Paris crept back into his mind. Paris, 1972. The applause was thunderous. Cameras flashed like lightning across the runway as Samuel's latest collection swept past in a wave of silk and velvet. Critics jotted frantic notes. Buyers whispered eagerly. And at the center of it all, Samuel stood backstage, his chest swelling with pride. Isabelle Duval emerged in the finale piece, a gown of midnight blue, adorned with delicate beading that shimmered like constellations. The audience rose to their feet. A standing ovation that seemed to last forever. Samuel closed his eyes, letting the sound wash over him. In that moment, he was invincible. But invincibility is fragile. 2 weeks later, scandal struck. A rival accused him of theft, a design too similar. A sketch leaked. Whispers of dishonor. The press, fickle and ruthless, turned. His name became less about brilliance and more about controversy. Clients withdrew. Investors vanished. He fought, of course. He defended his work, demanded fairness. But Paris had already chosen. Within a year, his studio closed. His apprentices scattered. His reputation was a memory, fading like perfume in an empty room. And so he left. America had promised nothing, but it had given him quiet. A tailor's shop in a forgotten corner of a city where no one asked about Paris. Where no one cared about runways. Until tonight. Back in the ballroom, Samuel exhaled slowly. The music swirled, the chandeliers burned, and the young danced, oblivious to the ghosts walking beside him. But Madame Duval's eyes never left him. And Samuel Marlowe knew, for the first time in years, that his past was not as buried as he had believed. The night of the wedding lingered in Samuel's mind long after the last song faded and the chandeliers dimmed. He returned to his small apartment above the tailor shop, the scent of pressed wool and machine oil welcoming him like an old friend. He set his leather sewing kit on the table, the same kit that had drawn so many eyes just hours earlier. It looked ordinary again in this quiet space, stripped of the glamour of chandeliers and gasps of astonishment. Samuel lowered himself into a chair, his knees aching, his body weary. The silence pressed on him, and yet the echoes of Paris refused to die away. Madame Duval's voice repeated in his mind. Once, you were one of the greatest designers in Paris. He rubbed his eyes. That was a lifetime ago. The world no longer belonged to him, it had moved on. Faster, louder, younger. His days were of alterations and hems, not runways and ovations. But even as he tried to push the thought away, his fingers itched, as though remembering fabric still waiting to be transformed. The knock. It came just after midnight. 3 sharp raps on the wooden door downstairs, startling in the stillness. Samuel frowned, rising slowly. Few people came to his shop at such hours. He descended the narrow staircase, each step creaking under his weight, and opened the door. A young woman stood in the streetlight glow. Her coat was too large for her frame, her hair pinned up in a loose knot. She carried a notebook under her arm, and her eyes shone with an intensity that reminded him of apprentices long ago. Mr. Marlowe? She asked breathlessly. Samuel hesitated. Yes, my name is Clara Jensen. I was at the wedding tonight. She held up her notebook, flipping it open to reveal scrawled notes. I'm a journalist, local press, and I need to talk to you. Samuel sighed. It's very late. I know, she said quickly, but I couldn't wait. I saw what you did to that suit. And then Madame Duval, she said your name. Samuel Marlowe. I went home and searched. You were him, weren't you? The designer in Paris. The one who vanished. Her words struck like stones. Samuel's first instinct was to close the door, to retreat into the safety of silence. You should go, he said gruffly, but Clara pressed forward, her voice urgent. Please, let me write about you. The world should know. You don't belong in a forgotten corner of this city. Stitching hems. Enough. Samuel snapped, his voice sharper than he intended. Clara flinched. He closed his eyes, forcing calm. Miss Jensen, the man you've read about is gone. There's nothing left to write. She studied him for a long moment, her eyes narrowing. Then she said softly, that's not what I saw tonight. And before Samuel could reply, she slipped a card into his hand, a folded piece of paper with her number written in hurried ink. If you change your mind, she whispered, call me. Then she disappeared into the night, leaving Samuel alone on the threshold, the paper burning in his palm. Madame Duval's visit. 2 days later, the bell above his shop door jingled. Samuel looked up from his workbench, expecting a customer with a torn hem. Instead, Madame Duval stepped in. Time had touched her, yes, but she carried herself with the same elegance she had once displayed on runways. Her pearls gleamed, her gloves immaculate. Samuel froze, needle in hand. Isabel, it has been years since I've heard you say my name, she replied, her accent curling warmly. He gestured stiffly toward a chair, though she remained standing, her eyes sweeping the modest shop, the bolts of cloth stacked in corners. The whirring old singer machine, the dust motes floating in sunlight. This is where you hide, she murmured. It is where I live. Samuel corrected. Live, she tilted her head. Or survive. He said nothing. Madame Duval stepped closer, her gaze intent. Samuel, Paris remembers. Some deny, some forget. But those who knew, we never doubted. That scandal was not yours. It was envy, sabotage. And yet you let them take everything from you. Samuel's jaw tightened. I was tired of fighting shadows. But you were not meant for shadows. Her voice sharpened. At the wedding, for a moment, you shone again. I saw it. They saw it. Do not tell me it is gone. Because I know better. Her words pierced him, stirring embers he thought long cold. You still have hands, she whispered, and vision. Paris may have closed its doors. But the world is wider than Paris. Samuel turned away, unwilling to let her see the storm in his eyes. The proposal. A week passed. Samuel buried himself in his shop, hemming skirts, shortening sleeves, patching jackets. But Clara's card lay on his workbench. A silent challenge. On the 8th day, the bell jingled again. This time, Clara herself walked in, bolder now, determined. I'm not leaving until you listen, she announced. Samuel sighed heavily. You were persistent. I'm right, she countered. He almost smiled at her audacity. Almost. Clara spread her notebook across the counter. The fashion world today, it's hungry. It devours trends, discards them, and begs for the next. They're obsessed with novelty, but do you know what they lack? Samuel raised a brow despite himself. Enlighten me. Craft, she said firmly. Soul. Everyone is chasing fast designs. Fast fame. But you created things that lasted. Things people still whisper about. If you returned now, you wouldn't just be a relic. You'd be a revelation. Samuel shook his head. You talk like it is simple. I am old. The world belongs to the young. But the young don't know what you know. Clara pressed. They can't see what you see. And that makes you dangerous. Powerful. She leaned forward, eyes blazing. There's a showcase next month. Independent designers. Small but growing. If you submitted one piece, just one, it would be enough to remind them. To remind you. The room felt suddenly too small. Her words pressing against the walls. Samuel looked down at his hands. Lined with age but still steady. He thought of Paris. Of gowns shimmering like liquid light. Of applause crashing like waves. And he thought of the jeers at the wedding. The way they silenced when he revealed his craft. Could he, after all these years? He lifted his gaze, meeting Clara's eyes. They were alight with conviction. With the same fire he had once carried in his own. I will think about it, he said quietly. Her smile broke like dawn. That night, Samuel sat in his apartment. Fabric spread across his table. He traced a line with his chalk. The faintest curve of possibility. His hands trembled, not from weakness, but from anticipation. For the first time in decades, Samuel Marlowe felt the stirrings of creation. And in the silence of his shop, he whispered to himself, perhaps, one more. The mornings in Samuel's shop had always been the same, muted sunlight streaming through dusty windows. The hum of the old singer machine. The steady rhythm of needle and thread. But this morning was different. The chalk lines he had drawn the night before still lingered on the dark fabric spread across his table. They glowed faintly in the dawn light, curved with a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. For decades, he had measured fabric only for alterations, shortening hems, narrowing waists, replacing buttons. Practical work, necessary, safe. But this line, this curve, it was something else. It was the beginning of creation. And creation was dangerous. Clara's return. The bell jingled mid-morning, and Clara swept inside, notebook under her arm. She looked brighter today, energized. Well, she asked without preamble. Did you think about it? Samuel didn't look up from the table. I said I would. You drew something, she observed, her eyes darting to the chalk outline. Perhaps. Clara grinned. That's progress. Samuel straightened, irritation flickering. Do not mistake hesitation for progress. This is a sketch, nothing more, but sketches become gowns. Clara replied softly. That's how it always starts. Right. Her words disarmed him. She was right. Everything had always begun with a single line. He sighed, rubbing his temples. Miss Jensen, you do not understand what you ask. To create again after so many years, it is like asking an old soldier to return to war. The body remembers, but the battlefield has changed. The weapons are different. Maybe, Clara said gently, but the soldier knows something the new ones don't. He knows what it means to survive. Samuel studied her for a long moment. She was too young to understand the weight of failure, yet her conviction carried an energy he couldn't ignore. The fabric hunt. Later that week, Clara insisted they go to the textile district. If you're going to create, you need the right material, she argued. Samuel resisted at first. But soon he found himself walking streets lined with bolts of fabric spilling from storefronts, satins shimmering like liquid light, wools rich and textured, chiffons delicate as breath. The merchants greeted him politely, unaware of who he once was. To them, he was just another aging tailor. And yet, as Samuel ran his fingers over the fabrics, he felt something stir, a hum beneath his skin, a recognition of old companions. He stopped before a roll of deep midnight blue silk. It shimmered faintly, not garish, but alive, as though it contained secrets. This one, he murmured. Clara tilted her head. Why? Because it breathes, Samuel said simply. A fabric must breathe. It must speak before it sings. He purchased several yards, his hands trembling slightly as he carried it home. Ghosts in the cloth. At his workbench, Samuel spread the silk carefully. He lifted his shears, the same pair he had carried from Paris, heavy and gleaming with history. The first cut was always the most terrifying. Once the blade sliced through, there was no going back. He hesitated, his mind filled with ghosts, critics shaking their heads, rivals whispering sabotage, the humiliation of his studio closing. Then he heard Clara's voice behind him. Breathe, Samuel. He exhaled, steadying his hands. The shears slid through the fabric with a clean whisper. And just like that, the journey had begun. The struggle. Days turned into nights. Samuel worked relentlessly, sketching, cutting, pinning, stitching. His hands remembered the motions. But his body grew weary quickly. His back ached. His eyes strained. More than once, he cursed under his breath, throwing down a ruined piece. Clara watched from the sidelines, sometimes fetching tea, sometimes offering quiet encouragement. She never interfered, but she never left either. You're pushing yourself too hard, she warned one evening. I have no time to waste, Samuel muttered, his needle darting. Then at least let me help. You cannot help, he snapped. Then, softer, this is mine. Clara bit her lip but said nothing. That night, Samuel dreamed of Paris again, of applause, of betrayal, of doors slamming shut. He woke drenched in sweat, his chest heavy, but when he sat at the table and saw the half-finished garment, something kept him moving. The skeptics. Word spread faster than Samuel expected. Perhaps Clara had whispered to the wrong ear. Or perhaps Madame Duval had spoken too loudly at another gathering. Within weeks, whispers reached the ears of younger designers. One afternoon, as Samuel carried a bundle of fabric down the street, he overheard two voices behind him. Is it true? The old Marlowe is making something. Please. He's finished. Probably making curtains. Paris threw him out. Why should we care? Samuel's steps slowed, the words slicing into him. But he kept walking, his grip tightening on the bundle. That night, he almost abandoned the project. Almost. But as he looked at the midnight silk draped on the mannequin, he thought of the groom's jacket, of the way the ballroom had gasped. He thought of Clara's unshakable faith. And he picked up his needle again. The breakthrough. It happened on the 12th night. Samuel had been struggling with the bodice. Unsatisfied with every attempt, he tore it apart, restitched, cursed, tore again. His frustration boiled. Clara, unable to watch his torment, finally spoke. What are you trying to make? Samuel froze. He stared at the mannequin, at the mangled fabric. He had been so consumed by perfection, by fear, that he had forgotten the answer. Slowly, he closed his eyes. He thought of Paris, yes, but also of America, of the bride's laughter, of Clara's determination, of his own reflection in the shop mirror. When he opened his eyes, his hands moved with new purpose. I am not trying to make Paris, he said softly. I am making me. And the fabric seemed to respond. The lines flowed, the silk draped with grace. The garment took shape, not a copy of his past, but a statement of his present. Stronger, humbler, but no less beautiful. The decision. By dawn, the dress stood complete. Midnight silk, cut with precision, flowing with a simplicity that carried weight. It was not extravagant, not shouting for attention, but commanding it all the same. Samuel sank into his chair, exhausted but alive. His hands trembled, his eyes burned, but his heart was steady. Clara stood beside him, awe in her voice. It's magnificent. Samuel nodded slowly. It is enough. She touched his shoulder. Then we show them. For a long moment, he said nothing. The thought of stepping into that world again terrified him. The lights, the critics, the whispers. But then he remembered the groom's jacket, the ballroom gasps, the way creation had returned to his hands. He looked at Clara, her eyes shining with hope. Yes, he said finally, we show them. The city buzzed with restless energy the night of the showcase. Neon signs flickered against glass towers, and the narrow streets leading to the converted warehouse pulsed with music and chatter. It wasn't Paris, not the grandeur of the Champs-Élysées, not the polished marble of Fashion Week, but there was a raw electricity here. The kind that made movements start. Samuel Marlowe stood just outside the entrance, clutching a garment bag that seemed heavier than fabric should allow. His suit was pressed, his shoes shined, but his palms sweated. The air reeked of cigarettes, cheap perfume, and ambition. Clara stood beside him, notebook tucked under her arm, her expression a mix of excitement and worry. You're trembling, she said softly. I am old, Samuel replied dryly. You're human, she corrected. They stepped inside the arena. The warehouse had been transformed into a temple of style. Spotlights swept across industrial rafters, illuminating a runway lined with folding chairs filled with editors, influencers, buyers, and the city's restless elite. Screens flickered with promotional videos. DJs pulsed music that rattled the walls. Backstage, chaos reigned, models half-dressed, stylists shouting, designers fussing with last-minute adjustments. Young men and women in bold outfits eyed Samuel curiously, some with amusement, others with disdain. Who invited Grandpa? One designer whispered to another, smirking. Maybe he's a sponsor, or a janitor. No, look, he's carrying a garment bag. The laughter stung, but Samuel ignored it. He had endured worse. Clara bristled beside him, but he touched her arm lightly. Let them laugh. Fabric will answer. Meeting the rivals. A tall young man with bleached hair and a leather jacket strutted over. His name, Clara whispered, was Felix Arden, one of the rising stars of the showcase. Well, Felix drawled, looking Samuel up and down. Didn't realize this was a nostalgia act. You here to show us how to make corsets again? Snickers erupted around them. Samuel's gaze was calm, steady. I am here to show what I have made. Felix smirked. Can't wait to see if the museum approves. Clara's fists clenched, but Samuel shook his head. He had faced critics sharper than Felix in his youth. The boy's words were nothing compared to the Paris press. The wait. Hours passed as designer after designer presented their collections. Music throbbed, lights flared, applause rose and fell like waves. Samuel sat backstage, his garment bag unopened, his heart hammering in his chest. Clara paced nervously. You should be proud already. You've made it here. That's more than most. Samuel didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the mannequin in his mind, the midnight silk. The lines he had drawn. The essence of himself stitched into every seam. When his name was finally called, the announcer hesitated, uncertain. And now, Samuel Marlowe. The audience murmured. The name meant little to most, though a few older faces tilted their heads in recognition. Samuel rose. Clara squeezed his hand once, then let go. The walk. The runway lights blazed white. The music shifted, slower now, softer, as though the DJ sensed the weight of the moment. The model stepped forward wearing Samuel's creation. Midnight silk flowed with every step, catching the light not in glitter but in depth, as though the fabric held oceans within it. The cut was clean, timeless, neither trendy nor old-fashioned, but something other, something enduring. The crowd leaned in. Felix smirked at first, but his grin faltered as the gown revealed its mastery, the balance of line. The way it sculpted the body without suffocating it. The way it whispered rather than shouted. Gasps escaped the audience. Phones lifted. Flashes strobed. Samuel stood at the edge of the runway. His breath caught in his throat. For a moment, he wasn't in a warehouse. He was in Paris again. Applause thundered in his ears. Lights blinded him, and beauty, pure beauty, walked alive before him. The reaction. The gown reached the end of the runway. The model turned, the silk rippling like water, and returned. Silence fell. Then came applause. Not thunderous, not yet, but steady. Growing, spreading like fire catching dry grass. Editors whispered urgently to assistants. Buyers scribbled notes. Even skeptics leaned forward, unable to deny what they had seen. Clara's eyes shone with tears. Samuel closed his own, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The critics speak. Backstage, reporters rushed him. Mr. Marlowe, where have you been? Is this a comeback? What do you call this collection? Samuel raised a hand, silencing them. His voice was calm. It is not a collection. It is one piece, one truth. That is enough. Clara scribbled furiously in her notebook, capturing every word. Felix stormed past, muttering, "Old man tricks," but his face was pale. His swagger dimmed. Madame Duval appeared then, her pearls gleaming in the harsh backstage lights. She took Samuel's hands in hers. "Mon cher, you have returned." "No," Samuel said softly, "I have arrived." The reflection. That night, long after the showcase ended, Samuel walked home alone through quiet streets. The garment bag was empty now, but his heart was not. He replayed the gasps, the applause, the recognition in their eyes. He felt both exhausted and alive, fragile yet renewed. At his shop, he set his shears on the table, their blades catching the moonlight. For decades, they had been tools of survival. Tonight, they had been instruments of resurrection. He whispered into the silence, one more thread, one more dream, and though no one was there to hear it, the city seemed to hum in reply. The morning after the showcase, Samuel Marlowe awoke to the sound of his phone ringing, a sound he rarely heard. For few ever called him. He answered groggily, "Mr. Marlowe, this is Elise Turner from Vogue International. We saw your work last night. Stunning. We'd love an interview." Before he could reply, another call came. Then Harper's Bazaar, then a buyer from New York, a gallery in Los Angeles, a curator in Milan. By midday, Samuel's small shop was no longer quiet. Photographers hovered outside, reporters knocked, and curious strangers peered through the windows, hoping to glimpse the man who had stolen a showcase with a single gown. Clara tried to manage the chaos, turning people away, scribbling names, promising callbacks. Samuel, meanwhile, sat at his workbench, staring at his shears. For years, he had longed to be remembered. Now, when the world finally called his name again, he felt only tired. The offers. That evening, Madame Duval returned, sweeping into the shop with her usual elegance. "They are calling you reborn," she said, placing magazines on his counter. "They call your gown timeless. A rebellion against fast fashion. Samuel, this is your moment. You must take it." Samuel flipped through the glossy pages. His gown glowed in photographs, critics praising its restraint, its soul. His name, once buried, now whispered again in reverence. And yet, he closed the magazine. "I am no longer the man they praise," he said softly. "I cannot fight the battles of runways, of markets, of endless demand. My bones are tired." "Isabel." Madame Duval studied him, her expression softening. "Then what will you do? Hide again?" "No," Samuel replied. His eyes lifted, meeting hers with quiet certainty. "This time, I will not hide, but neither will I chase." Clara's plea. Clara stayed late that night, frustration written across her face. "You can't stop now," she said, pacing. "This is what you've been waiting for, your redemption." Samuel shook his head. "Redemption is not found in applause. Clara, I have heard it before. It fades. But the world is listening," she pressed. "You could open a house again. Lead collections. Mentor dozens." "Mentor," Samuel interrupted quietly. Clara froze. He looked at her, really looked at her, her notebook always in hand, her fire never dimming, her belief in him unshakable. "Why not you?" Samuel asked. "Me?" Clara laughed nervously. "I'm a journalist, not a designer. You see differently," Samuel said. "That is the first requirement. Hands can be trained. Eyes cannot." Clara shook her head. "I wouldn't know where to start." "Then start here," Samuel said, gesturing to the fabric on his table. "Every stitch I teach you will carry more than technique, it will carry intent. That is what fashion has forgotten." Her eyes widened. "You teach me, if you are willing to learn." The silence that followed was not hesitation but reverence. Clara's voice was steady when she answered, "Yes." Passing the thread, weeks turned into months. The frenzy of attention slowly shifted elsewhere, as it always did. But in Samuel's shop, something new grew. Clara learned to cut fabric with trembling hands, to thread needles, to draft lines on paper. She made mistakes, dozens of them. Samuel scolded, corrected, encouraged. You rush, he would say. You doubt, he would add. And then, gently, but you see. And that is enough. She absorbed not only his skills but his philosophy. That fashion was not spectacle but storytelling. That cloth carried memory. That stitches could hold dignity. One evening, as she fitted a sleeve, Clara asked, "Why me?" Samuel smiled faintly. "Because you believed when I did not." The final runway. Nearly a year later, Clara received an invitation to present a small collection at a local exhibition for emerging designers. Her name was listed at the bottom. Barely noticed by most, she nearly refused, but Samuel pressed the envelope back into her hands. "Go," he said. "Show them not my legacy, but yours." On the night of the show, Samuel sat in the audience, tucked into the second row, unnoticed among brighter faces. His cane rested against his leg, his hair whiter than ever. The lights dimmed, music swelled. Clara's models stepped onto the runway, wearing garments that bore her hand but Samuel's spirit, simple, powerful, each piece breathing with care. Midnight silks, bold cuts, subtle lines that spoke of respect for fabric. The crowd stirred, murmurs rising. Samuel watched quietly, pride swelling not for himself but for her. He saw his lessons living in her work, but also something new, something he could never have made. At the finale, Clara appeared, nervous but radiant, bowing quickly before vanishing backstage. Applause followed her, not thunderous, but real. Samuel closed his eyes, letting it wash over him one last time. The quiet ending. After the show, Clara found him waiting outside, leaning on his cane. "Well?" she asked breathlessly. "You were magnificent," Samuel said simply. She laughed through her tears. "I only followed what you taught me." "No," Samuel corrected gently. "You followed yourself." They walked together down the quiet street. The night cool, the city humming with distant life. Clara carried the future in her stride, Samuel the past in his. And for the first time, Samuel felt no bitterness in letting go. He had not returned to Paris, nor reclaimed a throne. He had done something greater. He had passed the thread.